I wanted to welcome you all again to Brown University, to the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, and we'll have some people who can speak better about that than I will. But at every one of the Arctic Horizons workshops that we've done so far, it has been an essential part of our concerns with indigenous peoples around the circumpolar region and the effects that the world has, changes have on them. That we've had a greeting, a blessing, a few statements from members of the indigenous communities that were represented at the places where our workshops began. Here at Brown University, we are on the land that was the land of the Narragansett people, as far back as historical records and oral history tells us. And we have with us tonight to introduce our program Dawn Dove, who is an elder of the Narragansett Indian tribe and also a board member of the Tomaquag Museum, a traditional indigenous Narragansett-run museum in Exeter, Rhode Island, which I'm very proud to say has just received a gold medal from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, one of the highest awards for any museum in the United States. Dawn is very gracious to be with us here tonight because her daughter, Lauren Spears, who is actually the director of the Tomaquag Museum, couldn't also be with us today because she will be accepting the award for the museum tomorrow in Washington from the First Lady. And that will be simulcast as well. So I wanted to... This is an award a long time in coming, especially for a tribal community whose existence has been doubted or legally challenged over the years. And so it is a wonderful thing to be able to introduce Dawn Dove to say some words on behalf of the Narragansett people.
Asgawikwasan ni Tampawag, Natasui Dawn Dove, at Englishset, at Narragansett, Uchikawampak. Hello, my name is Dawn Dove, and in Narragansett is Uchikawampak. She searches for the break of day. Kanupian at Natakin, welcome to our land. I do want to offer some words, and I want to first to say I'm very honored to be here. The work that this workshop is doing, the Arctic Horizon, I'm very interested in your work. I'm certainly very interested in our land, our Mother Earth, and what we as people can do to save us, I guess is the word I want to say or to use. Before I begin the prayer that I've written especially for tonight, I'd like to offer just a little tobacco on these nice, clean, pristine floors. But we like to think of the four directions. Yuanash, Mayash, so important. Kautantuit, Kautantuit, Kautantuit. Kamayanauan, Katanan Tamawan Kanonash, Kanupi Alman, Ka Katabatatam Mawan, Wani Tapanan Tamwe, Akim. Kamaya Nawan, Katanan Tamawan Kanonash, Kanupi Alman, Ka Katabatatam Mawan, Wati Anki, Kakutamwi Tiayin Anonag, Hawan Piahata. Nia Kwampak, Kuanan Taman, Pomanum, Adwanu Wang, Watia Wahakinawan. Katapatamish, Wuchi Kakichi Sanonag, Nuwani Tapanantamwe, Squaw Sonoranok, Ka Nuwaski Tampanonag. Kisakwa, Kamayanawanap, Ka Kanauman ni Tapat Panash, Akitiang, Nagutiao, Kawajana Namapwap, Kamagana Natap, Now Machuang Pomantam, at Wunigan Mai Ka Wanua, Nashbi Nishno, Ankata Kawami, Kitianki, Jakwasanash, Nishno Jag, Naquintamu Manap, Pomantam Wunigan, Kitiank Yuat. Kautantuat, Katabatash Wuchi Yuanash, Mayash, Wampanan, Katapatatamish, Wampanan, Wuchi Mantaban, Wikwai, Ka Nusikwanuch, Shuangan, Sawanan, Katapatatamish, Sawanan, Kawuchanonanian, Wuchi, Nipaus, Akasapitiawank, Chikisuan, Katapatamish Chikisuan, Uchi Mishatashan, Ka Kachausha, Ka Naimpawag, Ka Kanamoyu, Ankanonag, Wata Anuamuash, Wayupayanonag, Wananamianet, Katapatatamish, Wananamianet, Wuchi, Suchi, Kataki, Kawuchi, Kapaki, Suwani, Nashwan, Kanonag, Nashbi Monigan, Mesquite. Kaltantuat, Katabatash Wuchi, Yuanash, Mayash. Kaltantuat, Taubat Niwayan, Wuchi Wami, Wamani Tank Niansh, Quinapuki, Kinawan, Kat Anu, Anawan, Kuwanagan. Kakatu Wanga Nonash, Atabantan Tamawak, Admanatum, Namanatuman, Napiauman, Ingin Kisakwat, Nashbi Kachikwanai Tahanonash, Katabatash, Wuchiwami Kamaguanash, Namanatuman, Katapatatamish, Kautantuat, Wuchiwami, Nuwamani Tank, Natank Sunonag, Ninaj. And I will share it in English. I'm thanking the Great Spirit for the 4 directions. Great Spirit, Kautantuat, 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 Great Spirit. We gather our minds to greet and thank the Creator for this sacred earth. We gather our minds to greet and thank the enlightened teachers who are here with us today. When we forget to live in harmony, they remind us. Thank you to our elders, our sacred women and men. Today we have gathered and we see that the cycles of life continue, we have been given the duty to live in balance and in harmony with each other and all living things. Everything we needed to live a good life was here. Kautantuat, Great Spirit, thank you for the 4 directions. Wampanan, the Spirit of the East. Thank you very much, Spirit of the East, for the daylight and our survival. Sawanand, Spirit of the South. Thank you very much, Spirit of the South. Please protect us from the sun's heat. Chikisuwan, the Spirit of the West. Thank you very much, Spirit of the West, for the storm and the thunder and the lightning and our ancestors' songs on the wind. Wananamianat, Northern Spirit. Thank you very much, Spirit of the North, for the snow and the cold weather and for making our spirits clean with good medicine. Great Spirit, Kautantuat, thank you for the 4 directions. Kautantuat, Great Spirit, we are thankful for all the love that is still around us. We send our choice words of thanks to the Creator. Our Creator, we come unto you today with our quiet hearts. Thank you for all of your gifts, our Creator. Thank you very much, Great Spirit, for all our beloved relations. Be it so. Thank you for listening. I also, at this time, especially want to thank the elders that are here or that will be coming. I also want to thank the Narragansett elders that have forever worked at reminding us of who we are as a people and for us to continue. And as you do your work this next couple of days, I thank you. We thank you because it's important for our Mother Earth. Thank you so much.
Now I'd like to introduce our Deputy Provost at Brown, Joe Measle, to say some words on behalf of the university.
Okay, thank you, Kevin, and thank you also, Dawn Dove, for that extremely moving blessing. You spoke of enlightened teachers here, and I certainly can see that you yourself are a very enlightened teacher. To all our distinguished guests, welcome to Brown. It's a much quieter place now than it has been for the last several days, so you've come at a good time to really focus on things. We've just got done with our commencement exercises and alumni weekend and corporation meetings, so it's been a very busy time, but this is now a wonderful time to focus on important work of the Academy, which is why we're gathered. From an institutional perspective, this is my brief to speak for the institution. It's very exciting to have this extremely important work happening at Brown right now, and I think there are 3 reasons for that from the institutional perspective, and that is Brown's past, Brown's present, and Brown's future, all of which I think relate very strongly to the subject of Arctic Horizons. Next year is going to be the 60th anniversary of the Hafenreffer Museum. In my role, I've had the pleasure of having a lot to do with the museum here on campus, and it's been fundamental to the museum to have Arctic research at its center, from Louis Giddings and Douglas Anderson and other outstanding scholars that have been at Brown. This has been central, so it is a long-standing commitment of the museum's and therefore of Brown's history in this area. In terms of our present, Brown just celebrated its 250th anniversary, but the university is continuously renewed, and currently the form of that renewal is our strategic plan, building on distinction, which focuses on a set of propositions about Brown's intellectual claims coming in the form of what we have called integrative scholarship. That is really bringing together the range of talent at Brown across fields, across areas, to address the really important questions that face the world today. And certainly the future of the Arctic is a great example of such a question. In terms of Brown's future, this strategy is shaping the way that we're developing going forward and what the university will become as it moves ahead. And one example, a central example of the kind of integrative scholarship and focus that we're giving to our academic ambitions and the way that we are building on existing strengths and developing them further is the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, in which we are sitting now. And this, we'll hear a bit more about it, but this is a great example of the integration of climate science and social science. We're doing a number of other things that really, I think, relate very closely to the substance and objectives of this workshop. Brown has been developing greater strength in policy-oriented social science, which I think is very important. We're capitalizing on other kinds of assets within the university to develop an initiative in data science, where we think we have something distinctive to do in that area. And most recently, we have also been drawing on existing strengths to develop a plan for moving forward, again, in ways where we think we can make a distinctive contribution in Native American and Indigenous studies as well. And a number of people in this room have been involved in that effort. So this is the way that I see, from an institutional view, this conference relating to very much what Brown is and what Brown is becoming. I think the distinguished list of participants for this event really exemplifies that set of integrative principles that we're staking our claim on as an institution and that we think of as our core values here. The conference, as I was looking at the list of participants, represents global scholars from a number of fields, leadership from government agencies, NGOs and research institutions, and people doing work that spans museums, laboratories, data analysis, policy work, diplomacy, just a great number of fields coming together in a common conversation around this hugely important topic. And we really think of that as what Brown is and should be a lot more of. So I think this is really opportune. I think we should also express gratitude to the organizers of this event and also to NSF. This is clearly one in a series of a number of events, very complicated to organize, but also, as a result, very powerful in all the talent that's bringing to bear on these questions. I think we can have the expectation that this will be a highly generative few days that you'll share at Brown, and also that this workshop, in conjunction with the ones that have preceded it, is a set of events that should have a very significant impact. So let me close simply by reiterating my welcome here to Providence, to Brown. Some of you are returning, some of you have been here before, so welcome or welcome back. And to move the proceedings on, I would like next to introduce my good colleague and friend, Amanda Lynch, who is the Lindeman Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies, Professor of Earth, Environmental and Planetary Sciences, and of Environment and Society, and also Director of this institute, the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. So thank you all for coming, and Amanda, on to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. So I will keep this short. I know you're all waiting to hear from Mark. I wanted to first acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and thank you so much for welcoming us here today. I'm really pleased to be a part of this series of workshops on Arctic social sciences in the 21st century. Although this institute is quite new in the Brown landscape, we've become an organising principle for the long tradition here of integrating natural and social scientific research to benefit people in their environments. The Institute supports research to provide the knowledge foundation for better policies and decisions that affect the sustainability of natural and human systems. Our teaching programs prepare future leaders to envision and build a just and sustainable world. Our engagement programs take research from the lab and the supercomputer to the State House, the hospital, the classroom, and the public sphere. So tonight we are privileged to hear from the former United States Ambassador to Sweden, Mark Brzezinski, who serves as Executive Director of the US Government's Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which was established to oversee implementation of the national strategy for the Arctic region. The role of this committee is to assure that federal activity is well coordinated with partners such as the state of Alaska, Alaska Native communities, the US Congress, the business community, international partners and other stakeholders. Mark has long experience in advancing the common interest in the Arctic, such as his involvement while US Ambassador to Sweden in developing key agreements involving Arctic search and rescue and oil spill preparedness and response. Mark initiated and helped develop the new US Fulbright Scholarship devoted to the study of the future of the Arctic. Today, his speech will examine the challenges, crises and opportunities that we as a nation and a global community will face in the changing North. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Mark to the podium and to the Institute.
Thank you so much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Dr. Lynch, for that introduction. Thank you, Kevin, for your incredible organization of this remarkable conference. Thank you, Brown University Arctic Horizons Workshop, for the opportunity to address you this evening. The timing of this event could not be better. The Arctic issue is ascending in media, in policy-making circles. Every major think tank in Washington, D.C., where I flew from this morning, is developing an Arctic initiative or an Arctic program. Tomorrow I'll present or brief the Council on Foreign Relations new task force on U.S. policy on the Arctic, and you're seeing that replicated in many, many other policy thinking and policy making spaces. It's ascending also within the federal family. The U.S. government through the creation in January of 2015 by President Obama of a unique government platform in the White House, and that is, as Dr. Lynch stated, the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But it is a year and a half old now. It is both domestic and international. Domestic, since our Arctic is the state of Alaska and the people of Alaska's Arctic, but also international, since we are one of 5 literal states around the Arctic, and there's 8 above the Arctic Circle as well. Every major U.S. government department is involved in the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Interior to the Department of Defense and Department of State, among others. More than 25 departments, agencies, and within the Executive Office of the President, the Office of Science and Technology, but also the Council for Environmental Quality, the National Security Council, the Domestic Policy Council. Importantly, Alaskans are involved. Fran Ulmer, former Lieutenant Governor of Alaska and Chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. John Farrell is here this evening, I'm pleased to see. Tommy Boudreau, Deputy Secretary, the Chief of Staff of the Department of Interior, is part of it. Raina Thiel, who runs the office in the White House on tribal and native engagement. Beth Kurtula, from the Council of Environmental Quality most recently, whose sister Anna is here this evening as well from NSF. The Arctic Executive Steering Committee is housed in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. It could have been easily housed in the National Security Council, given the security implications and the Arctic domain awareness issues that we face. It could have been housed in the National Economic Council, given the resources and commercial possibilities of the Arctic. But the President specifically chose to house the Arctic Executive Steering Committee in the Office of Science and Technology Policy because of the centrality of science as the foundation of the myriad of decision questions that we face in the Arctic. There is an uptick in focus on the Arctic, in part because it is part and parcel of our national dialogue on how we tackle the future. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. It is linked to our interests in our own backyard. The key is, or one central key of this is that we have currently a U.S. president who's personally interested in the Arctic issue and who's interested in amplifying the Arctic issue for the American people, given the decisions and questions that we have to face in the Arctic. And the urgency is clear. President Obama is the first U.S. president, and I was really surprised by this when I began my job last August as the executive director of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. There had been no president prior to President Obama to put his 2 feet in America's Arctic. Despite our huge interests in Alaska and the travel of Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, many, many others, no previous American president had put their 2 feet in the Arctic. And the higher meaning of the president's visit to the Arctic was clear in his own words. As he put it, the looming crisis in Alaska's Arctic is a tangible preview of the looming crisis of the global condition. For the president, the Arctic is a foreshadow. It is an augury. It is a preview of what will be coming down the path for the rest of us. So that is a central reason. His vision is a central reason for our focus, and it's not too early to assess our record a year and a half into this enterprise thus far, and to share with you what we intend to do in 2016 in the hope that what we put in place transcends this administration. The Arctic is so many things. It's native and tribal, as we heard from Don. It's health, it's shipping and maritime, it's energy, it's international, it's education. There are so many different challenges and opportunities. Importantly, the Arctic does not exist in a vacuum. The Arctic is really an interdependent reality. As the President indicated, if we can come together around the Arctic to build a shared understanding and launch an effective global approach, it will serve as a really powerful model for strategic questions we face elsewhere. So in that way, the Arctic is a beacon, and this moment for America, the Arctic is experiencing an awakening. So it is highly timely to host this conference, and I'm looking forward to discussing the various questions we have on the Arctic with you. As I said before, what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. That is why the Arctic is important. The Arctic serves as a refrigerator for the planet. What is happening right now in the Arctic in this spring of 2016? Arctic, as well as global temperatures in recent months, have been off the charts in comparison to recent records. And you have to remember, in 2015, they were off the charts as well, as they were in 2014. In certain ways, the unprecedented in the Arctic is becoming the new normal. January and February of this year set new records for overall warmth in the Arctic. Alaska has been warmer this spring than ever recorded so far. NASA's latest data show that this April was also record warm for the globe as a whole, but with some respite in some parts of the Arctic, though not in others, like, for example, Greenland. With temperatures already this warm, could we see an even more dramatic changes this summer when the summer arrives and we move fully into the wildfire season, as well as the melt season for sea ice and the vast ice sheet for Greenland? When it comes to sea ice, Arctic sea ice set a record in March this year for the lowest winter peak ever recorded. That means that during the time of year when there is seasonally the most ice covering the Arctic Ocean, there was the least yet observed. Very unusual fractures are also being seen in the Arctic Ocean ice cap between Greenland and the North Pole. Greenland has already seen a startling early surface melt event in April, which could set the stage for a great deal more as the summer rolls around. The critical factor will be the atmosphere, how much it carries warm, moist air over Greenland, as happened in 2012 when another record melt occurred there. When it comes to wildfires and permafrost, we've all seen the fires at Fort McMurray, Canada, in the last couple of weeks. Those were terrifying, and while well south of the Arctic Circle, scientists are wondering whether we could be in for a very bad fire year in other parts of Canada, Alaska, and Siberia. Last year, Alaska saw its second most extensive wildfire year ever. I was reading the Alaska Dispatch News this past weekend, and there was an eerie similarity presented by the press in terms of conditions this year with conditions last year preceding the wildfire season of last year. So as the Arctic warms more dramatically than anywhere else on Earth, of course it impacts the life of the 4 million residents within the region. The area of the Arctic sea ice in late summer is over 40% smaller than in the late 1970s. Ice volume is down even more. So that, of course, jeopardizes the food supply for Arctic communities reliant upon subsistence. It results in erosion of physical infrastructure, and I'll show you some examples of that from coastal villages. Open water instead of ice means bigger waves and loss of shoreline protection. It potentially leads to the relocation of entire Arctic communities and an expensive and traumatic event for the people of those communities. But it also impacts the rest of the planet, and that is a key message for Americans and the world. It impacts you in your own backyard. The loss of Arctic snow and ice results in rising sea levels and a higher occurrence of extreme weather events like storm surges and droughts. Temperature increases and loss of sea ice in the Arctic are altering weather patterns across the globe, particularly at mid-latitudes in North America, Europe, and Asia. Extremely hot days are becoming much more frequent, and extremely cold days much less frequent. Rain and snow increased on average, but now more comes as rain and less as snow. A higher fraction of the rain now comes as extreme downpours. 80% of the land in Alaska is underlain by permafrost. Permafrost thaw in the Arctic releases large quantities of greenhouse gases, such as methane and CO2, to the atmosphere, and this melt threatens buildings, roads, and energy infrastructure, in addition to the atmospheric impacts that I alluded to. Higher temperatures have resulted in more extensive wildfires. Here you have a satellite picture of smoke from Siberia coming across from the west, hitting the western part of the United States right around San Francisco. Higher temperatures result in drier landscapes, trees killed by insect infestations, more lightning, all related to climate change, mean more, bigger, and hotter wildfires. The combined acreage burned by wildfires in 2015 in Siberia, Canada, and Alaska by early August was about 31 million acres. In Alaska, the annual number of large wildfires has doubled since the 1980s. Again, the number of large wildfires has doubled since the 1980s in Alaska, and the average annual area burned has quadrupled. Wildfires, of course, destroy valuable timber and habitat, create massive smoke pollution, directly add large quantities of CO2 to the atmosphere, and contribute to permafrost thawing. All of these contribute to a positive feedback loop which exacerbates the impacts of climate change. So there is a direct interaction between what happens in the Arctic and what happens in the rest of the world. If we do not mitigate the impacts of climate change and increase resiliency, ecosystems could collapse, food and water shortages could result in large-scale human migration, contributing to both global economic and security disruption. On the flip side, any legitimate action to mitigate the impacts of climate change and enhance societal resiliency requires unprecedented levels of international cooperation. That's the essence of the challenge that we face, and as the Dean mentioned, really the intersection between the hard sciences and the social sciences. I have a lifelong interest in the Arctic, which I built on during my tenure as United States Ambassador to Sweden. As ambassador, I spent a lot of time with Sami communities in Sweden above the Arctic Circle, visiting them in their homes, having meals with them, and witnessing firsthand how climate change is impacting the central organizing activity of those societies, and that's reindeer herding, and in so doing, threatening Sami culture. In the Sami areas of Sweden, the reindeer have to be fed, if you can imagine this, hay from helicopters in the winter because new ice layers and numerous ice layers in the snow cover prevent them from being able to sniff the pasture through the snow, unlike in the past. Ticks, all Americans know about ticks. Ticks were never seen above the Arctic Circle in Sweden. Now ticks are all over the reindeer in northern Sweden. I did a series of films when I was ambassador with Sweden's leading actor, Felix Herngren, who also is not a scientist, but on the effects of climate change on that most local of populations. And our goal was just to combine our platforms, mine as ambassador, him as an actor, to get the message out about what is happening in the Arctic area and how it impacts you in your own backyard. We combined our platforms, and ladies and gentlemen, this is why the Arctic matters.
If this climate change keeps going at this rate, I'm pretty sure that the reindeer won't survive it.
Yeah.
It goes too fast right now. And without the reindeer, the whole Sami culture will disappear, and the world will be an indigenous people poorer.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's Nila Inga. He is a Sami leader in that part of Sweden that is above the Arctic Circle, and his warning about the complete loss of Sami society is one that we should heed. Because if we don't get global warming under control, our society too could be in trouble. So what is the most responsible way for Americans to approach the Arctic issue? The Arctic is simultaneously a strategic challenge and a human challenge. There is a great interdependence between the decision questions we face there, and any national approach has to take into account the deep and diverse ecological, cultural, scientific, economic, and security interests we have as a nation in the Arctic. In terms of our national priorities in the Arctic, they are diverse. These range from national defense, sovereign rights and responsibilities, freedom of the high seas, maritime safety, energy, environmental stewardship, preservation of indigenous culture, promotion of science and research. Those are a diverse set of objectives, and the starting point for consideration about where we go is where we are now legally and where we are in terms of policy. And the starting point in terms of the modern legal underpinnings for our national approach on the Arctic is the Arctic Research and Policy Act of 1984. That is the very first legal underpinning in the modern era pertaining to the Arctic. So our starting point as a nation on the Arctic is research and science. That act created two groups that coordinate federally funded Arctic research: the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and IARPC, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, housed within the National Science and Technology Council. In 2009, policy directives on national security and homeland security were created to address these interests in the Arctic, and those directives established priorities which advance international cooperation, sustainable resource management, economic development, and scientific research. In May 2013, only 3 years ago, the U.S. National Strategy for the Arctic was published. That was the first ever national strategic approach to implement the vision of our leadership ever that we've had. That was followed by an implementation plan in 2014. In the federal government, strategies have to be tactically implemented using a roadmap, and the implementation plan of 2014 really raised the bar of our national strategy up a level in terms of providing a report out to the American people regarding what we in the US government who work for you, the American people, are doing on the Arctic issue. Today, almost every federal agency in the US government with responsibilities in the Arctic now has its own departmental Arctic strategy to specifically guide internal agency priorities. When I began as executive director in August, I got underway with another implementation plan, but had it have two pieces to it. One, a record of what we have underway, but also second, a forward-looking piece to capture the commitments and promises this president and our government has made to do on the Arctic across the range of issues, and that was released in March of this year. Also very important is the development of the IARPC Science Plan 2013 to 2017 and related working groups established to more effectively coordinate and science and share information. I have to say that we have also tried to be very opportunistic on the Arctic issue, using every day that we have. We've had 2 state visits in the last 90 days to the White House, one from Canada, the other from all the 5 Nordic leaders. So we had 6 of the 8 Arctic countries in the White House on state visits, and we used both of them to cumulatively create a commitment now committed to by 7 Arctic countries, including us, on commercial development in the Arctic and that any future commercial development in the Arctic has to be consistent with criteria pertaining to sustainability, the environment, science, and I think that that's important because 7 of the 8 Arctic countries are now under that commitment. So we're being very opportunistic when it comes to the Arctic issue as well. Let me say just a little bit about the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, because that is meant to create a unity of purpose among the federal family and a shared sense of the opportunity and a shared sense of the challenge on the Arctic issue. It was created in January 2015 by the President because I think that there was a sense that our Arctic approach was fragmented and not effectively coordinated. And so the goals of the committee are to, first of all, set priorities. Among the many, many things that we could be doing on the Arctic, what will be the main things that we do? Second, very important for President Obama, once we set and declare those priorities, we need to evaluate and assess progress in achieving milestones pertaining to them. So what's an example of that? When the President went to the Arctic in September, he rolled out 3 packages of commitments called deliverables. Some were more high profile than others. The building of new icebreakers, the renaming of Mount Denali, the Denali Commission's new role on resilience. But as soon as we were back from the visit to the Arctic, I created a spreadsheet to identify commitments and promises made, person responsible for achieving them, timing, milestones, agency responsible. And we've pursued delivering for the people of the Arctic and for the rest of the United States achievement of those deliverables. So EPA promised grants for water and sanitation, a very challenging issue area for rural Alaska, for remote native communities. We have delivered on those. USDA high energy cost grants to support communities in especially high energy cost areas in remote Alaska. Energy is through the roof in terms of prices in America's Arctic and in the Arctic generally. That's the kind of evaluating and achievement of milestones that we've been pursuing. A third goal for the Arctic Executive Steering Committee is to advance coordination among state, local, and Alaska Native tribal governments, Alaska Native organizations, academic research organizations, and other stakeholders. We have been absolutely embracing the huge number of Alaskans and Native communities who come to Washington to talk about the decision questions that we face together, and we have been getting as many senior officials out to the Arctic as possible in the course of this administration. The President was clear that his visit to the Arctic was not meant to be the apex, but the beginning of high-level Washington engagement on the Arctic. And since then, we've seen our Secretary of Transportation visit and meet with Native communities on transportation issues in the Arctic and Alaska. We've had our Secretary of Energy recently in remote Alaska talking about energy challenges and energy innovation in remote areas in Alaska and so forth. The last goal of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee is to support the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council. We are halfway through our chairmanship before we turn it over to Finland in the spring of 2017. And that chairmanship, which is spearheaded by the U.S. representative for the Arctic at the State Department, Admiral Papp, has been absolutely advancing on key achievements, including negotiating a scientific cooperation agreement among the Arctic Council members, among other goals. Dr. Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, chairs the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. Amy Pope, who is a Deputy National Security Advisor, serves as its Vice Chair. The show of the U.S. commitment to the Arctic is seen in the number of federal agencies conducting and supporting activities in the Arctic. So what have we done and what are we underway with? In Washington, as they say, you are your budget. The President's 2017 budget request really reflects, for the first time ever, a national imperative when it comes to the Arctic issue. Resilience, $2 billion proposed for resilience nationally, $400 million for Alaska. The Denali Commission is identified as the correct vehicle for coordinating a plan for addressing resilience, adaptation, relocation, and the like, between federal, state, local, and native. $150 million is proposed to build what it takes to build a new heavy icebreaker, and the President had an S at the end of icebreakers when he made the promise in September. $63 million for science and research at the NSF. This reflects an all-in approach when it comes to the Arctic. Another thing that we pursued heavily as soon as we began the Arctic Executive Steering Committee was trying to bring the President to the Arctic and to execute his wish to get there. Why was this such an opportunity? Well, where the President goes, the eyes of the world goes. And that's important because still too few people are aware of the challenges and opportunities of the Arctic. The President traveled to Alaska in September to bear witness firsthand, and we used particularly sites in the remote Arctic area to message clearly important things. For example, on the photo to the right, the President is the glacier behind the President used to extend to the location where the President is standing. The President's visit also provided the opportunity to focus on key challenges, for example, coastal erosion. The President was able to visit coastal, rural Alaska, where all kinds of erosion and permafrost melt is happening as warming sets in. The impacts of thawing include land subsidence, threatening buildings, roads, and energy infrastructure. Permafrost thawing is accelerating coastal erosion, threatening the built infrastructure and the safety of coastal communities. One of the first interagency working groups established under the Arctic Executive Steering Committee was the Coastal Erosion Working Group, now the Community Resilience Working Group. And the Denali Commission is really meant to serve as one-stop shopping for matters pertaining to coastal resilience, which will be only, unfortunately, a growing challenge in coastal Alaska. Shipping and maritime is another key challenge, but also maybe an opportunity as the Arctic changes. Given the potential to cut transit time from Europe to Asia by transiting via the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passages, the opening of the Arctic has the potential to impact shipping routes, much like the building of the Suez and Panama Canals were, but of course nothing is being built. It's just that new channels are melting. And for example, a voyage from Rotterdam to Shanghai via the Northern Sea Route is 22% shorter than by the current route through the Suez Canal. They are expecting by 2025 a 500% increase in Bering Straits transit over current levels. We're also seeing new types of vessels transiting the Arctic. I saw last night that the Daily Beast had a story on the Crystal Serenity's tourist cruise from Seward, Alaska to New York across the Northwest Passage. And the commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard has met with representatives of the tourist cruise industry and has been assured that more cruises are on the way. So we have to make absolutely sure that we have the appropriate search and rescue infrastructure in place in case there's a problem. And we're testing and exercising both tabletop and live. We have had a tabletop exercise, Arctic Zephyr, and are planning a live exercise in the Arctic area called Arctic Chinook to advance search and rescue capabilities. Another strategic challenge is marine security and environmental stewardship, which requires infrastructure. As I said before, President Obama announced new steps to accelerate the acquisition of a new Coast Guard icebreaker from 2020 to 2022. the 2017 budget includes $150 million for design of a polar icebreaker, including completion of programmatic planning documents and design activities. What you will see are questions being considered in the government regarding deep water ports in the Arctic to support both domain awareness, search and rescue, scientific cruises, and the like. We're also developing new unmanned vehicles, NOAA is, that can penetrate and observe the changing Arctic on a continuous basis. The role of science, though, needs to be amplified and aligned, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But it's very important to realize that the Arctic is not a place where America is preponderant. It is a place of immense scale and expense to operate in, and therefore a collective approach on the Arctic is the most effective approach. When the president visited Alaska in September, he took part in a conference called Glacier that was meant to bring the international community together around the Arctic issue. More than 20 governments participated. 7 foreign ministers were there, including the foreign ministers of Korea and the Netherlands, not Arctic countries, but great shipping countries, to bring them into the conversation. Glacier provided an opportunity to have a comparison of undertakings to see where we are compatible with different countries around the world and doing things that can be expanded jointly. An example of that cooperation is seen now in the new Coast Guard Arctic Forum. That ties together international cooperation and marine stewardship. And with the new Coast Guard Forum, 8 Arctic nations will leverage collective efforts to foster safe, secure, and environmentally responsible maritime activity in the Arctic. In addition, the U.S. Coast Guard is actively working with international partners to implement high-priority actions identified by the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, including enhancing collaboration on bilateral agreements with neighboring Arctic countries. A key element of the President's vision, though, is to improve the consultation process with the Alaska Native communities. One of the most terrifying books on the Arctic that I read in preparation for this assignment is a book that I recommend to all of you called The Firecracker Boys. And it's about a program that was advanced in the 1950s with support from state policymakers in Alaska, the Department of Energy, state legislators, the business community, even the clergy in Alaska to use nuclear devices, I repeat, nuclear devices, to blow open examples of ports that then could be shown to countries around the world who were interested in port development. And there was no need for such large ports in northern Alaska. This was purely almost like a sales tool. And it got far down the road before local Alaskan natives, in really, I think, almost the first example of local native community organizing, stopped because those nuclear devices would have blown up their communities and their territories. If you can, that was not too long ago where that degree of insensitivity was basically targeting the native people in northern Alaska. And one of the commitments of this president is to improve the consultation process with the native community generally across America, but also more particularly in the case of what I work on, and that is the Alaskan native community. Half of the 560 U.S. federally recognized tribes live in Alaska or the American Arctic. And during the president's visit to Alaska, he went to native communities. He met with fishermen on Kanakanak Beach, focusing on protection of salmon runs in Bristol Bay, the most important salmon run in the world with large importance for both commercial and subsistence fishing. But he has directed those who work for them to really get on the stick when it comes to consultation with regard to native health. And there are some very serious, tragic health crises in the native community in Alaska and in the Arctic area, to focus on land co-management, energy, water and sanitation challenges, and the like. And so we are zeroing in on that in as many ways as we can. We can enhance our understanding of the Arctic through better coastal mapping and charting. To better understand changes in both marine and terrestrial environments in the Arctic, a new digital elevation model initiative to develop high-resolution topographic maps of the Arctic is underway. Developed by the National Science Foundation and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, they are collaborating with academia and industry to develop publicly available, high-resolution, satellite-derived maps of Alaska by 2016, so all of Alaska by 2016, and of the entire Arctic by mid-2017. On the screen behind me, you can see the elevation map of Alaska's tabletop mountain using the best data previously available to the public, but compare that to an identical map using the new data. You can see how the new data will enable scientists, but also the people who live in the Arctic, and as more and more people visit the Arctic, that clearly is important. We need to do better in terms of figuring out what is happening in terms of changes to the flora and the fauna in the Arctic. What you're seeing behind me is a pileup of walruses that have happened now in successive years on the coastline of Alaska. And 35,000, 40,000, 50,000 walruses you can see from planes in these pileups. And why it's happening, some people say it's because of the less availability of ice in the water, where the walruses used to pile up. Now so they go to the hard rocks, and there are implications for the walruses in these circumstances that are very negative. But more generally, what is happening to the flora and fauna? There are new species popping up in the Alaskan ecosystem, never seen before. You take, for example, the arrival of white-tailed deer in parts of Alaska that have not seen them before. Deer carry sometimes viruses that can affect local populations, and there's many subsistence communities. Not too long ago, I met with Port Lay subsistence community leaders, and they are more than anyone able to bear witness and report to you how their ecosystem has changed dramatically in a very short amount of time. But there's also a role of scientists. Take, for example, the changing ocean chemistry. In addition to reduced salinity as a result of increased discharge to the ocean of glacial freshwater, the Arctic Ocean, like the rest of the global ocean, is becoming more acidic. Ocean acidification is intensified in the Arctic by the low temperature and low salinity of the ocean there. And the effects of these changes include, for example, impacts of acidification on marine organisms that make their shells or skeletons with calcium carbonate. The interaction of salinity changes with changes in the temperature to alter ocean circulation, and this impacts all of this together on marine fisheries, with consequences that are still largely unknown but potentially severe. When I was younger, I traveled through Alaska with my brother, and we went to Glacier Bay National Park. There's a very good chance that in my lifetime, Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska will have no glaciers. Most mountain and coastal glaciers across the Arctic are shrinking. It's the best evidence of a changing Arctic, but unfortunately it increases river discharge and turbidity, in turn affecting erosion and potentially fisheries in the ocean as well as in the rivers. Alaska's glaciers alone are losing 75 gigatons of ice annually. Muir Glacier in Alaska is right here. Look at the change in just 60 years. Take the Greenland ice sheet, much bigger. and that's experiencing extensive surface melting in the summer, as well as acceleration of the flow of major coastal glaciers to the sea. Water on the surface of the ice increases absorption of the sunlight and thus produces further melting. Total loss of ice from Greenland is averaging 250 to 350 gigatons annually, up four times in the last 2 decades. In the 2012 image here, the darker pink represents confirmed melting and the lighter pink probable melting. The last time melting of close to this extent occurred was 1889, and that was a result of a local warm spell, not a global one, as now. So what's our path forward? The indicators are grim. When it comes to temperature, the most recent IPCC assessment, 2013 to 2014, projected that summer temperatures in the Arctic in the last 20 years of this century, under business as usual emission growth, would average about 7 degrees higher than the 2005 to 2015 level. When it comes to sea ice, under business as usual emissions growth, sea ice in the Arctic Ocean in the late summer could disappear altogether in 2040. When I think about my 6-year-old daughter and the world she will inherit when she's 60 or 70, I really shudder. The 2014 U.S. National Climate Assessment projects another doubling in annual areas burned in Alaska when it comes to wildfires by mid-century. So what is it that we can do together? First, mitigation. We need to agree upon and commit and follow through on ambitious national targets for emissions reductions. We need to work together across national, state, provincial, local, and tribal governments, the private sector, academia, and civil society to identify and deploy cleaner, more efficient technologies for energy supply and use. We need to work together to make the data, technologies, and information on best practices more available to help communities. And we need to, when it comes to research, improve understanding of challenges and opportunities around climate change in the Arctic through data sharing and cooperative research. We need to collaborate on geographically denser, more comprehensive, and more continuous measurement and monitoring of Arctic climate change and its impacts. Unprecedented international scientific cooperation is needed to build a shared understanding and collective response to the impacts of climate change in the Arctic. And so I want to report to you that in 2016, for the White House, the capstone on the Arctic issue will be the following. There never has been before a meeting of science ministers from around the world on the Arctic issue. That surprised me, actually. There's been a meeting of environmental ministers, for example. There's been an environmental ministerial that the Swedes held on the Arctic issue. But science and pooling alignments between our government and governments around the world, and advancing alignments between governments around the world, even if they don't include the United States, has not been done with an Arctic science ministerial. So I'm pleased to report to you that the White House will host on September 28th the first ever Arctic science ministerial, bringing together not just the Arctic countries, but countries that have an interest in the Arctic, even though they are distant from the Arctic geographically, but they're investing in Arctic science. On my flight up here from Washington this morning, I began to read some of the proposals, not just from the Nordics, but from Asian countries and from elsewhere. And it does give me hope that if we can develop an approach jointly and more effectively and efficiently use our science resources with a range of engagement and a range of expense, we can do something which is the shared self-interest that we have all in the Arctic issue, and that's our children and grandchildren. So we are really excited about trying to create a platform that will transcend the Obama administration, but in which others around the world can share in and join in. As we pursue these goals, we need to collectively share the Arctic challenge, too few people know about it. The Arctic is still somewhat of an esoteric and extraneous issue. Here's a clip of President Obama's appearance on the show Running Wild with Bear Grylls, which is, I think, akin to the mission that we all have, and that is share our science beyond the scientific community and communicate in a understandable way the challenge that we all face. I can tell you that when it comes to the White House Arctic Science Ministerial, we are particularly zeroing in on deliverables that are politically understandable. Here is the clip from one of the platforms that we have tried to communicate the Arctic more on, reality shows, but we've also really zeroed in on social media, traditional media, and every possible way to communicate this challenge that we share together.
So a bear has chewed on this sucker.
Yeah, but we're going to cook it up, so it's going to be good.
All right.
So I think the president looked a little surprised when I pulled out this sort of bloody carcass of half-eaten salmon.
Oh, I heard a little sizzle there.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah. I think a piece of salmon, that'll work just fine. It would have been nice if we had had a cracker to go with it.
Okay, should we try a little bit of this?
Yeah, let's try that. That's tasty.
Well, that's proper Alaskan salmon for you.
Communicating the Arctic and a responsible way forward is what we're trying to do with the Arctic Executive Steering Committee in the White House. We need your help, especially as we look to the White House Arctic Science Ministerial at the end of September. Thank you for listening. I'll take your questions. Looking forward to talking with you. Thank you. I was told by our technology guru here in the back that if there are questions, people should approach the stick mics here to ask those questions. And please identify yourself by name and affiliation when you have a question. So, yeah, yes, ma'am. Yeah, okay. Any questions? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. I see. Yes, well, okay,
So, thank you. That was a really enlightening and interesting presentation. My name is
Thank you.
Jessica Shadian. I'm with the University of Toronto, but also on a Nansen professorship at the University of Akureyri this year.
Terrific.
And my background is global politics. So, my question, you kind of spoke to it in grand sweeping gestures, I guess, and maybe if you can go poke down a little bit into a little more nuance. I'm interested in, because it seems like the steering committee is a bridge in a way between the policy world, which is not just domestic, but interacting with the Arctic Council and science. And so in one way, I guess I'm wondering if the steering committee, much like the European countries often do, which is not tradition to the National Science Foundation, is would there ever be an interest in allocating money to NSF for very specific policy relevant questions that the steering committee might want to answer in thinking specifically in the realm of policy making and Arctic Council and regional policy. And at the same time, is it a responsibility or of interest for the steering committee to also help promote and bring the science that the NSF does into the policy world, into Arctic Council and other policy fora? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And let me start by saying that one of the things that the Arctic Executive Steering Committee has tried to do is to support as much as possible IARPC, which, as you know, is the platform within the federal government that is meant to advance scientific collaboration between the agencies as much as possible. And that has been, I feel, very successful. Simon Stevenson is here. He ran IARPC while he was at OSTP, and I felt very effectively integrated scientific studies, research undertakings with decision questions that the various departments face in a way that had not been occurring before. There has to be a relevance between science and policy making, and I think that that is what we have IARPC for, and so we're trying to support that as much as possible. It meets regularly. It's got great leadership also with Martin Jeffries right now, and with a budget proposal for NSF in the millions and millions of dollars, clearly the Arctic is an imperative in terms of science as well. And so at this point, you know, I think what we're trying to do is to see what kind of combinations we can advance, not just within our government, but between our government and others around the world. The point is that the Arctic is of a scale and an expense that really requires us to combine with others if we're going to get it right. And at this point, it's a little bit, it's not as coordinated and as combined as it could be. That's the goal of the ministerial in its essence. And I've actually been very reassured to see the proposals that we've gotten from others, that people are looking at this ministerial in the open-minded way that it is being organized. The President's science advisor, John Holdren, will be chief of delegation, and what I have loved that he has done is that he has gone to the 20+ foreign governments that have been invited and not said, here's our deliverables, please bring your money and come to our party. Instead, he has gone to the foreign governments as a very first step and said, bring your ideas, bring your proposals, and let's see what we can combine together. Let's see what we can align as governments. And that process is underway right now. It is the essence of science diplomacy, and I truly feel that part of getting the Arctic right is getting the kind of an international an international scientific undertaking underway like never before. So that's the goal that we have right now. Questions?
So science coordination is one thing, and we at least have a structure in IARPIC in terms of dealing with that. But there's what you really highlighted in your talk is that multifaceted nature of problems in the Arctic. And certainly in my experience, when you're dealing with communities in the Arctic, a lot of their problems tend to fall between the cracks between federal programs. When you think about things like relocation of coastal communities, you're actually engaging with many different agencies, and there are a lot of gaps between them. So I'm wondering if the executive committee is thinking at all about agency coordination, not just in terms of science, but also in terms of action on the ground, in terms of the impacts that we're seeing in communities already in the Arctic.
Yes, absolutely, we're thinking about that. And that's why the Denali Commission has been teed up as the appropriate vehicle to coordinate between agencies, federal, state, local, and tribal, because we had heard as much that there was gaps and overlaps in terms of interfacing with the federal government when it comes to coastal erosion, resilience, and adaptation. But when you're talking about coastal erosion and resilience, you're talking about an expensive undertaking. To relocate a village of 60, you're talking about $60 million, $70 million. That kind of money has to be transparently and properly managed. And so we're setting up the management structure first, while we also develop a work plan, and that will be the first step to getting underway. But time is not on our side. I mean, there is absolute notice from the state of Alaska that Kivalina, Newtok, other places face a dire threat. So we are focused on this, thinking also of contingencies beyond the Denali Commission in the case of emergencies. Any other questions?
My name is Igor Krupnik. I work at the Arctic Studies Center at the Smithsonian. I'm wondering about this ministerial in September.
Yeah.
Yeah, what kind of a model do you have in mind as a follow-up? Like a new like Antarctic Treaty, something that would be signed by the ministers to create some sort of a permanent agreement for the Arctic, or more like another international polar year, a program of science, focused science research. There'll be 20 people, or as you said, maybe more, in this meetings. And what is the scenario for them to accomplish?
Thank you, Igor, for that question. The essence of what we're trying to do is to create an opportunity to engage international partners in a cooperative setting of priorities when it comes to Arctic science. That's the essence of what we're trying to do. When it comes to the specifics, what we are doing is we are going to have the what precede the how, meaning that we are now receiving proposals from different governments around the world, and this is a government ministerial. It's not a general conference on the Arctic and the challenges we all face there. It is meant to be a working ministerial between government ministers to broker and develop alignments. So there we have two folks who have been tapped to be the leaders of an executive committee to really pull together the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to see where, say, Sweden or Australia or the United States fit together. Simon Stevenson from NSF here is part of that executive committee. It's co-led by Martin Jeffries and Jeremy Mathis. And so we are just receiving these right now, and so there probably will be a short communique or joint statement at the end that's visionary, but that will point specifically to fact sheets that are meant to identify combinations and joint undertakings and the like between governments. But there was also a call to action issued last week via on a White House link inviting NGOs, institutions, organizations, individuals to submit ideas and proposals as well. And if they are appropriate and are relevant to the 4 central themes that John Holdren has identified as the focus of the ministerial, then there's a possibility that they will make the fact sheet. The 4 themes that John Holdren has identified are observing and monitoring, resilience second, third, Arctic science, fourth, STEM and education. And those are all found on the announcement that was made via the White House blog post by John Holdren on May 13th, I believe. So that's where we are. And that's the focus of it. Again, it's something that's never been done before. It is the essence of science diplomacy, because we are teeing up a scientific challenge to see how governments around the world can develop a cooperative, cooperative setting of priorities. And I'm keeping my fingers and toes crossed, but I'm reassured by what I've seen so far.
Kevin Smith here from Brown University. Mark, wonderful talk. And when I think of, as we all think of the enormity of the challenges that you're looking at, the scale of them, thinking about infrastructure as you talk about that, and looking to the future, especially in an academic setting like this and with this group, I wonder if there's a lot of consideration being given to whether we really have the academic infrastructure within the United States, the number of institutes and centers and other places to really train the researchers and policymakers that we're going to need for the future to manage these things on a scale which, as you said, we're looking at our children, at our grandchildren, but also at very immediate issues. And I just wonder what's being thought about in your group and in others at the higher levels of government.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for all you did to organize this visit. That is a great question, and I can only respond anecdotally. I can tell you that having spent 4 years in Sweden focusing on the Arctic and visiting scientific sites there, visiting Alaska a number of times, including the University of Alaska at Fairbanks and at Anchorage and so forth, absolutely we have resources. The scale of the Arctic challenge, the velocity with which it is changing, the activities of other nations around the world, and the increase in that make me hope that we put as much resources as we can into the myriad of questions that we face in the Arctic, and there are so many. Whenever I and it's just really, besides I work for John Holdren, who's the chair of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, and Amy Pope, but it really is just me focusing in the White House on the Arctic Executive Steering Committee's work. And whenever I come back from Alaska, I come back with pages of action items to follow up on whether it's, serious health challenges in native areas and substance abuse that's on the increase in certain native areas, shipping and maritime questions, and the possibility of, not the possibility, but the fact that we need greater alignment between our friends and partners around the world, importers and exporters, as the Arctic Ocean changes and there's more shipping and maritime. The energy questions, where in the Arctic, energy prices are such a central organizing challenge in rural communities because it's stunningly expensive, 10 times the cost of what it is in the lower 48, while on the flip side, there's incredible renewable and alternative energy innovation. And so that's just me in the policy world. Whenever I do short visits there, I can only imagine in terms of the scale of possibilities and scholarly questions that need a serious, in-depth consideration there are out there that are not being treated now. I, for one, having done a doctorate, feel that there are so many doctorates and deep dive research questions to be undertaken that I hope are treated in the future because it's in our national interest to have as much of an understanding of some of these things as possible.
If there are no more questions, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you at dinner.